A critical energy shortage is escalating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Hospitals are either shutting down or limiting services because there is no longer fuel to power generators. And the UN, the largest provider of aid, says it will have to halt operations tonight unless it gets gasoline for its trucks. Israel is not allowing fuel into Gaza over fears it may fall into the hands of Hamas. Now, as we continue to report on this conflict, there are, of course, growing concerns about misinformation, particularly with the increased use of social media platforms and that need for speed in sharing information. So for more on this, we've reached former war correspondent Arwa Damon in Istanbul. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
First, given your experience, I'm hoping that you can share with us some of the critical challenges when it comes to covering a war zone.
Look, it's extraordinarily difficult, especially when we're talking about trying to cover breaking news inside a war zone, because information is just coming at you from all of these different directions. You have what you're hearing that is directly happening on the ground from eyewitnesses. You have what's coming at you from different governments. You have what's coming at you from any sort of analyst, anyone with a network. And add to all of that, you have everything that's happening on social media and this huge task of trying to sift through what's real and what is not within that space. And despite the fact that that is extremely challenging under those circumstances, what we also do see, and what experience tells us, and what my experience of doing this for 20 years tells me, is that when we're covering a conflict that is as emotionally charged and as violent as this one, key players within that conflict space, whether it's governments or armed groups, also will jump on the bandwagon of trying to push through their own agenda and their own messaging. We know this to be true. And what we have seen in the past, and what we are seeing right now, is that we cannot necessarily put government statements in the credible source category, which adds an extra burden onto every single journalist covering this when it comes to how they present information and at what point in time do they present that information.
And certainly that would be true for those not covering war too. It's important to keep in mind that having to critically look at the lens when it comes to any statement from any government organization as well. Now, you recently wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council that was published this week, and in it you call on journalists to be more vigilant in seeking the truth right now. What have you observed?
Look, a lot of what's happening right now in the media space on one level is reminding me a lot of what we saw happening post 9/11, where the Western media did play a significant role in aiding and abetting the US narrative and the US attempt to try to dehumanize first Afghans, then Iraqis, then Muslims, and then Arabs. And I was in the United States post 9/11. I was actually in New York, and watching that kind of coverage is what propelled me to be a journalist, because I am Arab American. My mother's Syrian. I grew up very cross-cultural, and it just did not make any sort of sense to me that the kind of demonizing, vilifying rhetoric that I was hearing across American airwaves was actually referring to human beings. And we're seeing this right now. We're seeing Palestinians being put in a position, not for the first time, I must add, that they are having to make the case that they are human, that they bleed, live, love, laugh, just like anybody else. I mean, if you really think about it, it is absurd right now that Palestinians feel as if they need to prove that they are equal human beings to a Western audience. And the media has historically, and right now I do feel as if is continuing to play a role in the dehumanization of the Palestinian population. And we see this, take it from, the banners that networks are choosing to use, to specific terminology that is being used, to the way that certain guests are pushed back on, to the way that some information is just absorbed and then regurgitated without proper verification. And that is why I do feel that there is this even bigger burden of responsibility on us as members of the press to make sure that we are being extra vigilant so that we don't end up being part of, this game, so that we don't also fall prey to this dehumanization campaign that's happening, and that we rather focus on what it is that we are meant to be doing.
And
We're
now,
meant to be providing accurate information. We're meant to be educating the population on complex issues they may not be fully aware of, and we're meant to actually serve as building bridges.
Arwa, I understand the observations that you're putting forward here, and of course, notably, there is propaganda on both sides here that is extraordinarily common during a time of war, and something that, as you've mentioned, journalists need to be very, very cognizant of. I want to also bring forward a change, a shift that has taken place, and that is the rise of news on social media platforms, and what role you think that plays in sometimes getting information out that is not making it in other channels, but on the other hand, in really spreading misinformation as well, because there might not be critical content consumption. So the onus then also falls on consumers. So how do you digest that?
It's actually quite interesting, this whole social media phenomenon, because on the one hand, yes, you have the trolls, you have those with, vile intent that are out there, that are deliberately spreading misinformation, that are deliberately making inflammatory remarks, hoping to spark something bigger. And then there's also the risk of just how things can get oversimplified. Everything gets diluted down to a single hashtag at times. And that really doesn't do any of us any favors, especially when we're dealing with such a multi-layered conflict such as the one that we're observing right now. On the flip side of that, though, what we're really seeing, especially among a younger generation, is that they are turning more and more to social media to try to a certain degree, verify what they're actually hearing on the mainstream media. And what social media has now done is give not just Palestinians, but any population that feels as if its voice is not being properly heard, but we're talking about Palestinians right now, it has given them a voice. It has given them the space to be able to actually reach a much broader audience than they were ever able to reach before, because their words were so controlled, their access to the outside world, to the international media waves, were so controlled by the media itself. So on the one hand, we are seeing many more people who would not be aware of what it is and what it means to be Palestinian, able to gain a much deeper understanding of what that is. But also, of course, the flip side of that is all of this misinformation that ends up spreading around like wildfire. And viewers and consumers don't like to hear that actually there is more work that they need to do. People do want that quick fix, that quick, reshare. But we need to also accept the reality that there is more work to be done, not just on the side of the media, but on the side of the consumer as well. Otherwise, we're just going to get stuck in these same cycles of vilifying, dehumanizing, polarizing various different populations against each other. And that actually terrifies me.
Arwa, thank you for your observations today. We appreciate your time.